It would be easy to think that we have today an Obama administration 2.0, but that's really not what we're seeing unfold, because we're seeing pressure on Iran. We're seeing military strikes against Iranian assets in Syria. We're seeing sanctions against Iranian officials for human rights abuses. And we're seeing that the Obama administration is not that the Biden administration is not rushing into a nuclear deal at all cost. But they are focused on diplomacy. And it seems that this administration therefore understands that maximum pressure on its own does not deliver, and that diplomacy on its own can lead to unintended consequences. And it looks to me like they're striking a good balance of combining both engagement and pressure. I'm Kim Ghattas. I'm a journalist and author. I covered the Middle East from Beirut for decades, as well as American foreign policy from Washington. I'm a contributing writer at The Atlantic magazine, and I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. I'm also the author of Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. There's been a lot of criticism of the way the Biden administration has approached the Middle East in the 2 months that they've been in power by those who thought that the Biden administration would rush into a new nuclear deal with Iran. The idea was that they were ready to take up where President Obama had left off. And so there is criticism both in the Middle East, but also in the US from democratic progressive circles of the administration, because there's a sense that the Biden administration is wasting valuable time in re-entering the nuclear deal. I see it differently. I see members of the administration who have served in the previous administration under President Obama, who have learned from what they did right and what they did wrong, and are trying to apply those lessons in their current positions as they revisit how to approach the Middle East. They are taking their time, but they've also moved very quickly in signaling very clearly that they know what they're doing, that they're approaching both their partners in the region and their foes in the region with a different approach than we've seen. In a way, you could say that it's a combination of President Obama and President Trump. President Obama was really hoping that he could set the region on a different trajectory, but he was disappointed both by some of the failures of the Arab uprisings, the fact that many of these uprisings devolved into conflict. Some of these failings are a failing of the American administration itself and how it handled the region, for example, in Syria especially, but also Bahrain, and of course you could say in Egypt. President Obama was very focused on obtaining and pursuing a nuclear deal with Iran. But President Obama's approach was always one of thinking that he had the right way forward and that others should come along. And therefore, he did not spend enough time explaining the benefits of this nuclear deal to America's partners in the region, whether it be Israel or the Gulf countries. Also, President Obama wanted to get the nuclear deal at all cost. And in doing so, he acquiesced or turned a blind eye to the other problems in Iran's behavior in the region. Its actions in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. In reaction to that, America's partners like Saudi Arabia decided that they should take some matters in their own hands. And so you saw Saudi Arabia go to war in Yemen, for example. And since then, you've seen the Saudis, but especially the Emiratis and other Gulf countries, grow closer to Israel in a way to counter Iran's behavior in the region and in a way make up for what they saw as President Obama's failure to contain Iran. Since then, the region has changed a lot under President Trump. Under President Trump, you saw a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. That involved covert action, sometimes by the United States, we assume, a lot by Israel as well, we assume, against Iran itself, but also against Iranian assets in the region. And the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, etc., are part of that, in a way, anti-Iran front. They stand alone for their benefits as agreements for strategic purposes and commercial purposes for a country like the UAE, but they are also part of an anti-Iran front. So that was part of what was driving President Trump and his allies in the Gulf. It became a very anti-Iran policy, but it did not achieve anything truly tangible beyond cornering Iran and potentially empowering Iran's hardliners even further. So today, with the Biden administration, we see a combination of engagement and pressure, because members of this new administration, like the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, the new Deputy Secretary of State as well, have all been there before. And there is no doubt that there must be a return to engagement with Iran on the nuclear issue, because Iran is advancing in its nuclear program. And that was made possible for them when the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear talk, the nuclear agreement. And the Biden administration is coming under a lot of pressure domestically by Democrats, by the progressive left, to re-enter the nuclear deal as quickly as possible. But that's not what we're seeing. And so I think that even if the Biden administration has not communicated word for word, we are not Obama 2.0, I think its actions show that they're not Obama 2.0, because they are taking their time. They are signaling to the Iranians that there is not going to be lifting of sanctions, all sanctions again, as soon as Iran, or as a precondition to Iran returning to the nuclear deal. They have made clear that they're willing to wait for the right conditions, for the right framework. And as I mentioned, they have signaled, again with actions, that there will also be pressure on the Iranians and not only engagement. And so when you look at the US military strikes on Iranian assets in Syria, that's a very strong message. And when you have sanctions imposed on Iranian officials at the same time as America is signaling that it wants to return to nuclear talks, that is also a very strong signal. All American officials who have spoken out on these issues, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, and President Biden himself, have made very clear that they want to engage with Iran and come back to a nuclear deal that is improved and fortified. It's not just a return to the original deal of 2015, that they also want to address Iran's ballistic missile program, and that they want to tackle Iran's behavior, expansionist behavior in the region. Whether they do it all at the same time, whether they do it on parallel tracks, that's a question of strategy and tactics. But it's easy to assume that because you see some of the same faces, that we've gone back to the old ways of the Obama administration. But the actions that we see from the Biden administration clearly demonstrate that there is a different approach, and not just towards Iran, but also towards America's partners in the region. The Biden administration has also made very clear that there are no blank checks on issues related to human rights, freedom of expression, and general accountability, governance, and rule of law. So whether it's Iran or whether it's Saudi Arabia, this administration is coming not with a bombastic freedom agenda like the Bush administration, nor with a lofty, aspirational but very difficult to implement hope for the region the way President Obama brought with him, nor with a Trump-like administration blank check for dictatorships. They're coming with a much more realistic understanding that as they try to pursue their own interests as a country, because after all, that's what any country does, whether it's Russia, Iran, or the United States, they have interests. But America does also try to align those interests with values. And it seems to me that they have understood that they need to work harder to align interests with values, because values like accountability, rule of law, governance can ensure long-term stability for the region. Whereas if you pursue stability at all cost and you turn a blind eye to the abuses of your friendly dictators like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, or the atrocious atrocities in a country like Syria under President Assad, because you want to obtain a deal on chemical weapons, you end up undermining the possibilities of true long-term sustainable stability based on governance and rule of law. And that's what you're seeing, to the extent possible, being telegraphed and communicated by the Biden administration in those first 2 months already. I think history has shown that stability at all cost and at the expense of justice, rule of law, and governance has led to disaster. Nostalgia for the stability provided by dictators is not a policy. I cannot tell you whether in the end the Biden administration will return to this equation of pursuing stability no matter what, because administrations often start with the best intentions and then find themselves in the difficult position of having to deal with realpolitik and having to deal with players in the region who, even when they are America's partners, don't always deliver for the United States. It is, however, easier to put pressure on America's partners than on America's foes. How do you get Iran to release dual Iranian-American citizens? And there are many languishing in Iran's jails. It's difficult. Do you include that in the nuclear negotiations? Do you carry out military strikes and say, okay, we'll stop if you release some of these prisoners? How do you do it? How do you get President Assad to change behavior? Can he still change behavior? Is that something that America should seek? How do you get forgiveness for the atrocities of the last 10 years in Syria? Should the United States be pushing for regime change again in Syria? Is that really what we want America to be doing, to push for regime change? Could it even do that when you consider that Russia now has such a big role to play in the region, that it has backed President Assad not into a victory, but into maintaining his ability to stay in power? I think that American officials must understand that stability at all cost does not deliver. Not only does it not deliver for the citizens of this region, but it does not deliver for America. same way as there's been a lot of criticism of the Biden administration's approach to Iran by those who felt that America should rush back into a deal and to engage with Iran, there's also been criticism of the very measured way in which the Biden administration released the CIA declassified report on the Saudi Crown Prince's involvement in the killing of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in October 2018. The Biden administration was really stuck between a rock and a hard place. They had to legally eventually release this report. And so they did it on their own terms. They did it certainly with prior coordination and talks behind closed doors with the Saudis to tell them what they should expect, because we heard very clearly from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, saying they were pursuing a policy of no surprises. And that's a reference to how the Obama administration handled the nuclear talks. The Gulf states and Israel felt blindsided by that. And that was one of the reasons why there was such a backlash. Now, it's true that the CIA report doesn't say 100% that MBS ordered the killing, but you can infer that he played a clear role in allowing this to happen, whether he gave the direct order or not. And there's disappointment, of course, that the Biden administration did not sanction Mohammed bin Salman. They did sanction top Saudi officials. They imposed a travel ban on several officials as well. Congress is going to pursue further ways of punishing MBS. We'll see if that leads to something, or if President Biden ends up in a position of having to veto a bill that comes to his desk. But I saw the Biden administration's approach to dealing with Saudi Arabia, a difficult partner under Mohammed bin Salman, as a very balanced, a balancing game between pressure and support, pressure and engagement. I don't want to say they're using the same approach as towards Iran, because Iran is a foe and Saudi Arabia is a partner, even if it's a difficult one. But anyone who expected Mohammed bin Salman to be sanctioned this early on and this immediately by the Biden administration was going to definitely be in for disappointment. And for those who are worried that the Biden administration is a repeat of the Obama administration, where it was all about engagement with Iran, can you imagine the celebrations amongst Iranian officials if Mohammed bin Salman had actually been sanctioned by the American administration? So they tried to find a balance there as well. They tried to signal very clearly to Saudi Arabia that they're on notice and that Mohammed bin Salman is not welcome in the White House, because he's just the Minister of Defense. He's the Crown Prince, but he's the Minister of Defense. So his counterpart is America's Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. They've made very clear that the pressure will continue, and the pressure has already delivered a little bit. I would say that human rights are definitely on the agenda for this administration, with a lot of pragmatism as to what you can do and what you can't do, and what you can achieve and what you can't achieve. And there will be priorities. That's unfortunately the nature of politics. It's hard when you're sitting in the Middle East to accept that. It's hard when you look at America as the only country that still speaks out on human rights, because of course there are also those who see America as trampling on human rights, whether it is with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or whether it's support for dictators, or whether it is the deals that it makes with autocrats around the region as it pursues its own interests. And as I said, interests is what drives foreign policy of any country. But no one calls on Russia to protect them as a human rights activist. No one calls on Iran to protect them as, or to protect freedom of expression. That is still the remit of America in this region. Will they compromise? Yes, they will compromise. How much? No one really knows. Will they make a nuclear deal conditional on human rights being respected and Hezbollah being reined in and Assad being removed? No, it doesn't work like that. You have to pursue parallel tracks, and you have to see which gains are worth which compromises. What looks clear to me is that this administration will not pursue a nuclear accord at the expense of everything else, which is very much what I feel President Obama did. Will they be able to get the nuclear deal and everything else? No, because we live in the real world, and that's just not how it works. Will they be able to find a compromise whereby they rein in some of Iran's regional activities, whereby they ensure the release of more Iranian activists and dual citizens from Iran's jails? That's more possible, that's more realistic. But you have to remember always that America cannot get things done just with a push of a button, because they're dealing with countries and governments that have their own agendas, their own limitations, their own domestic constituencies. Mohammed bin Salman can't just release everyone he's put in jail, because he has to justify that to some extent to his constituencies, his supporters, and there are many, whether we like it or not. He has many critics, but he has supporters. And similarly for Iran, they cannot just release all the dual US-Iranian citizens or all the activists in jail, because there are internal politics. It cannot be a favor to America. It has to serve Iran's interests. And so the idea is that you want to find ways to make it appealing to Iran to make those compromises, or to increase the cost for not making those compromises. Sometimes it doesn't matter what we want or how much they understand the region. They have their interests. I don't believe that they're coming to just continue where President Obama left off. A, because they've learned a lot from where they went right and where they went wrong. But B, because the world has changed. And so you cannot simply pretend you're back in 2016, where in 2021 and the region and the world have changed. So you learn from the mistakes and you adapt to the current circumstances. And from my perspective and from my experience of dealing with some of them as American officials when I was based in Washington and interviewing them as a journalist and questioning them during the first and second Obama administration, my sense is that they understand the region in a very pragmatic way. They're well informed. And when they say that the Middle East is not going to be a priority, what they mean with that is that it has to be less of a priority than it has been in the past, because it took up too much energy, too many resources, too much time and too much attention at the expense of other more important files like the relationship with China. But if this administration wants to focus on the big files like China, like climate change, it has to get a few things right and on the right trajectory in the Middle East. And that's what I see them doing. The key people are Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor. He's young, the youngest National Security Advisor in America's history. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden during the second Obama term. He was a senior official under Hillary Clinton at the State Department, her director of policy planning, her deputy chief of staff. He is very smart, works really hard, is very open to debate and discussion, thinks that the Middle East takes up too much time and too much energy and too much resources, but understands that, as far as I can tell, certain things need to be addressed and certain things are a priority in the region. And he thinks of the world in terms of frameworks, institutions, not people. He's not looking to see how Abdel Fattah al-Sisi can serve America. He will probably be looking to see how America can support governance, rule of law, and justice to set up something that is more sustainable for the future. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, was National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden during Obama's second term as well. Very pragmatic, very well liked, down to earth, loves music, played in a band, speaks French, and will have very much the backing of the president in whatever mission he is on, which is very important for foreign counterparts to know that the Secretary of State really speaks for the president. You have Rob Malley, Special Envoy for Iran. And I know that there's been both a lot of enthusiasm about his nomination and a lot of fear about his nomination, depending on where you stand vis-a-vis Iran and its policies in the region. Rob Malley is very much about engagement, and can sometimes miss the fact that engagement can also not lead anywhere unless it is backed up by forceful diplomacy. He is known to a lot of the players in the region. He played a key role in the nuclear negotiations that led to the nuclear deal. The Iranians know him, they trust him, which is an asset. But those who are concerned that Rob Malley will drive all of the Middle East policy and will therefore, in a way, impose engagement at all costs and a nuclear deal at the expense of everything, are probably missing certain elements of how an administration works, because at the end of the day, the final decisions are in the hands of the president, but also the National Security Advisor. And my sense is that the White House will drive Middle East policy. Then you have Brett Mcgurk, White House Special Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa, who served under President Obama during his second term. Mostly was known then for his role as the coordinator in the policy against ISIS, Daraj, and continued that role under President Trump. Brett Mcgurk is often described as not being an ideologue. He's a good implementer of the policy. He does get criticized for getting Iraq wrong, for supporting policies that eventually enabled the rise of Shia militias in Iraq. So no one is perfect. And as Jake Sullivan once told me himself, American foreign policymakers are, at the end of the day, fallible human beings who try to do their best with the information and the tools that they have. That's not an endorsement of American foreign policy, it's just a statement of fact that this is how, how they try to operate. What I find very interesting is that one of the problems with American foreign policy is that it is short-term. It can last 8 years under one president, or it can be cut short and change after 4 years with a new election. And very often that's a handicap, because American policymakers are dealing with players in the region, but also in other countries, in Asia, in China, in India, in Japan, with players who have often been around for longer. Qasem Soleimani, now dead, had been around forever. He knew all the rules of the games, all the different players. He was on a personal relationship with all of them. He had long-term strategic vision. Today, you have several players who have been around in high positions. I'm not talking people who have risen through the ranks and who 10 years ago were at the bottom. No, they were already at the top, like Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken. And they have now come back 10 years later, and they can pick up the game, in a way, of foreign policy and hit the ground running. They know the players. They know the rules of the game as players in the region are playing it. They've already had to deal with some of them in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Iran, in Egypt. And so I think that they're at an advantage for once, because they're not newcomers. So you can worry about the fact that these are known faces. But if they've learned from their mistakes in their first postings or under the policies of the Obama administration, then they're in a much stronger position today to return to the table, to the chessboard, much better informed, not only about the region and the policies that they want to implement, but about the players that they're dealing with. For example, next week, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, are going to meet high-level Chinese officials in Alaska. This is a very important meeting. And who are they going to meet? They're going to meet Yang Jiechi, the director of China's Office of the Central Commission for Foreign Affairs, who used to be foreign minister when Jake was on Hillary Clinton's team, and had to sit with Yang Jiechi and have discussions about some of these same issues that they're going to be discussing today. Minister Wang Yi, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, is also a known quantity to both Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. So they come into these negotiations, into these conversations, whether it's with Chinese counterparts or whether it's with Middle Eastern players, with a much better understanding, not only of the players, but also of the rules of the game, with counterparts that think with a long view. America's always thought with a short-term view. It doesn't do foreign policy and diplomacy with a 40-year trajectory. It does it in 4-year increments. And so this time, I think that the approach and the understanding and the framework is going to be a bit different. So as Lebanese, we of course always think that we are the center of the world and should be the center of attention. But it is true that in many ways, Lebanon is important. Strategically, geopolitically, and from a pluralism perspective, and what it can still offer as an example for the region. Lebanon is important for an American administration, any American administration, because it sits on the border with Israel, because it hosts over 1 million Syrian refugees, because it is home to Hezbollah, a political party, but also a militant group that has become a regional expeditionary force loyal to Iran. So there is no way to divorce Lebanon from America's outlook on the region. America cannot do Iran policy without looking at Lebanon. And it also needs to have a Lebanon-specific policy, because not all of Lebanon's problems are connected to the region. Our corruption is very much our corruption. the lack of reforms is very much on the Lebanese political class, and that will not be resolved if you have a nuclear deal, or if somehow, Hezbollah agrees that it should not play a role in Syria or Yemen. So my advice, let's say, to any American official is to look at Lebanon for both as both a local domestic problem, Lebanese politics, Lebanese economy, etc., and also see it in the larger framework of the region. The other reason why Lebanon is important is because of the economic crisis. If we see a real collapse, a real failure of all systems, the state as a state is already failed, but as a country, we are still managing to hold together as a society. But if you have a full collapse, that has repercussions on the region, on Europe, if you see a flood of refugees heading to Europe. But it's very important that the United States don't see Lebanon only as a humanitarian issue, because there is potential beyond addressing humanitarian concerns. And it's very important that it remembers that here too, stability at all cost is not a long-term sustainable solution. So quickly putting together a government just for the sake of putting a band-aid on the problem is not going to serve anyone's interests. I think that if you look at what the sort of organizing principles are of this administration, when they talk about tackling corruption, kleptocrats, etc., around the world, I think that will continue to apply to Lebanon. They may not impose more sanctions, because sanctions are a very blunt tool, but I don't think, will lift any of the current sanctions that are in place on Lebanese officials or former officials. The goal will be to pursue accountability and an anti-corruption drive. But Lebanon is not the number one priority, and it shouldn't be. A lot of the solutions are here within us in Lebanon, and with the right regional context, I think progress can be quick and the recovery can be quick as well. I think we often make the mistake in Lebanon of thinking that the answer and the solution is going to come all prepackaged from abroad, whether from Iran or whether from America or China. That's not how it works. And that's been, I think, our biggest, one of our biggest failings. It's certain that a lot in Lebanon cannot be resolved unless there is a more favorable regional context, unless there is some movement on the nuclear file. Today, Lebanon is being used as leverage by Iran in its dance of diplomacy with America. So we are stuck. But should we just wait until things get unstuck? Or is there room to work on a realistic? We often, or I have seen often, Lebanese officials or Lebanese activists go to lobby in Washington with calls for help, but with no concrete requests. Please help us, full stop, doesn't work. Please help us because we have this proposal for a public-private enterprise to reform the electrical sector in Lebanon, for example. Please show support for independent reforms, etc. Does that mean that we should just wait until things get unstuck? No. There is room for, in many ways and on many fronts, Lebanese-made solutions, which can then garner support and enthusiasm from the international community. I do think it's very unfair for Western observers, French officials to say, well, where is the alternative? We don't see the opposition getting organized. We don't see alternative leadership. It's very hard. The odds are stacked against people in Lebanon. They get assassinated. Rising political leadership gets assassinated as a much better, much sounder, much more transparent alternative to the corrupt establishment, the mafia and militias that are currently ruling this country.